So just a couple, I guess, like housekeeping things kind of right up front. My internet is a little bit on the fritz, so I'm hoping to make it through today without any major crashes. But if not, I already have told Michelle that I can record the lecture separately and she'll just post it on iLearn. And then the second thing is, because we are going to be moving through this information pretty quickly, not all of the slides are going to be like explicitly talked about. My sort of MO is to provide as much information and as many resources as possible. And then that way you guys can have the opportunity, if there's something that piques your interest, to kind of explore it on your own. So rather than having like a long list of references at the end of my presentation, which probably will not be very looked at, I try to embed references throughout. That way they're a little bit more contextualized. And again, you can look them up if you're interested, but we're not necessarily going to talk about every single thing. So that said, this is what we're up to today. So we're going to be talking about book prep for literacy-based therapy. So I think you guys have the like more formal literacy-based therapy steps posted on iLearn as well. So we're not going to be diving like too deeply into the actual steps of the framework, but we're going to be more so talking about how I think about a book and how I prepare in advance for delivering a lesson using the literacy-based therapy framework. So I'm just going to skip through here. Any questions before we get started about language sample analysis? I know that you guys have turned in your assignment and done the language sample analysis. Was there anything that came up for anybody that you had kind of lingering questions about while you were working on that? You can just kind of pop in or raise a digital hand. All right. Well, then we will move on.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
I was observing a 16-year-old. He's in 11th grade. He's very smart, but due to his cerebral palsy, he chooses to speak natural speak, but his speech is really hard to understand. Mm-hmm. And only people that knows him very well, like his family and his one-on-one, his personal assistant, I would say, understand him, but the rest, especially new people like me, very hard to understand him. And I record him, and even recording, I have to like listen many times to kind of understand something. So how can I pick a language sample, or what can I do to measure this his language?
Yeah, so the thing that I would say about that is, any data is good data. And the fact that you don't understand him is still data. That is going to help inform your perspective of how this person communicates with unfamiliar communication partners. And maybe, maybe something to work on moving forward would be that like your strategies for communication are going to change based on who your communication partner is, right? Like I have lots of students who don't use their devices at home because their families say like, well, we can communicate just fine. We understand each other. It's all good. But then at school, and particularly, let's say in like the general education classroom, those aided means like a talker or a communication board or what have you, those things become that much more important. And so I think like it's okay to say that 60% or more even of the language sample was not intelligible to you. It's okay to say that. That's data, that's information that you have. Even as an unfamiliar listener, you are still a trained speech language pathologist. And so it could be that for someone who's like a peer, that intelligibility is even lower, and it would be important to know that. So um, I don't think I don't think that you necessarily need to get like a more intelligible language sample. I think reporting the information that you have is totally valid and valuable.
Thank you very much.
All right. So once you have done your language sample
Melissa,
analysis, yeah.
sorry, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the circumstances under which it's most effective to collect language samples. If you wouldn't mind spending just a few minutes talking again about elicitation strategies and you know and how how it's best to collect those samples, I think that would be really helpful as a reminder for everyone.
Sure, yeah. So your elicitation strategies are going to change depending on what exactly kind of information you are looking for. So, and also the age and kind of developmental level of your client. So if you're looking to elicit the most complex language structures, the most complex syntax, and maybe the most complex vocabulary, then you're probably not going to want to use a conversational or a play-based language sample. The most complex syntax and vocabulary and all of that stuff for younger children is usually elicited through narrative language samples. And then for older clients, either like adolescent or even adult populations, persuasive and argumentative. So like asking somebody to do like debate team style, basically, like pick a stance and try and convince you of it. That is the way that you're going to elicit the most complex information. That said, I'm not always looking for the most complex information. I also do conversational language samples where the information that I'm searching for is more about like the function of language, right? Like um what communication purposes are they using? Are they asking questions? Are they answering questions? Are they negating? Are they requesting things? Those sorts of that kind of information is easier to elicit through conversational or play-based or kind of more open-ended language samples. I also am looking for in conversational samples, just generally more pragmatic skills. So like turn taking, topic maintenance, those kinds of things. So it just depends on what kind of information you're looking for. And so I would say before you decide what context you're going to be using for elicitation, you first need to know what information you need. Does that answer your question, Michelle?
It does. And then I just want to clarify also that these language samples are best collected in kind of in a one-on-one versus like observing a child in a group. Or would you say that that's okay to observe a child in a group? What are the, in terms of like, how would you talk about that?
I think, again, it's a matter of what kind of information you're looking for. So a one-on-one language sample with like you, let's say, or like as a clinician, that's going to give you information about how a student or a client is able to interact with a single person, probably an adult, right? And like not necessarily a familiar adult, but like a paid worker. So like that's kind of one of the you know, one of the options on the talc is that you're a paid worker, even if you're very familiar.
Uh-oh. Is everyone else not frozen except Melissa?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bummer. Hang on, I'm gonna text her. Okay, oops, I'm gonna pause this recording.
Let's try it again. Michelle, you need to give me
Oh, again.
controls
Okay.
again.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, no problem. Sorry about that. I didn't realize.
We're off to a really great start.
Okay, you are again co-host.
Okay, thank you. Oh my gosh, come on. Okay, so if this happens again, I'm just gonna record it for you because that's probably a better situation. Okay, so let's be quick. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about a system that I use called the Meaningful IEP Worksheet, which is basically like a framework. I love frameworks. It's a framework for how I often think about taking the information that I have from an assessment and making meaningful goals out of it. So we sort of talked last time about how subtests in the self, let's say, or whatever standardized tests do not necessarily make the most meaningful IEP goals or like therapy outcomes, right? So if I have a student who like really did poorly, like first percentile on idioms, that doesn't mean that having a goal on idioms is going to be real functional for that student, right? So the meaningful IEP worksheet is kind of how I think about what is going to create a relevant and like functional skill set for this student. And as I mentioned before, all of this stuff is linked for you guys, so you will have access to it. This is the blank version. There's also an example version filled out. But basically what I do is take all of the information that I have from my assessment. So I might divide this out into like expressive, receptive, social, and speech, for example. For an AAC user, I could also divide it out into linguistic, operational, social, and strategic, right? Like those 4 domains. So however I want to think about structuring my students' goals, I'm going to go through my assessment data and just list like what are the strengths and what are the needs, what are the areas they did really well, what are the things that either were missing entirely or like sort of minimally present and need a lot of support. The next thing I'm going to do in this column is input how is this impacting them in the classroom. An example that I'll give you like from a sort of minimally disabled student is like, if I have a student who one of their needs is saying the S sound, right? They can't say the S sound, but there doesn't appear to be impact in the classroom. They're still participating, they're still raising their hand, there's no social emotional impact. They don't appear to be frustrated by their errors or self-conscious about their errors, right? that might not be something that ends up being a real relevant goal for that student. So my job as a school-based speech language pathologist is always, always, always to provide therapy that is relevant to the curriculum. And so if there is no impact in the classroom, then that's not an area that I need to intervene. Um, there are lots of ways to like make arguments for things kind of one way or the other. They could be an impact in the classroom, or like maybe later it will have some kind of social emotional repercussions. But that's the impact in the classroom. The barriers that those things create between a student and their learning have to be considered in the environment that I work in. So for those things that you're seeing are an area of need and that do have impact in the classroom, those are the things that are going to be your most functional goals, right? You're going to get the most value out of a goal that students have the opportunity to practice a lot in the classroom in their sort of natural, school environment. But it's also important to consider which of these actually require specially designed instruction from a speech pathologist. So let's say, again, like back to our example of a student who can't say an S sound, let's say there is an impact in the classroom, but when the teacher reminds them to use their good S sound or whatever, they're able to do it. Well, that's not something that requires specially designed instruction. If anybody can provide that instruction, then it's not something that needs to be in our scope, right? So ASHA really pushes us to work at the top of our license, to do only the things that we can do as speech pathologists. And so that's kind of where we want to spend our time and our real estate for goals as well. In the school setting also, there's sort of a mantra that goals drive services. So however many goals you have and however much time you think it's going to take to meet those goals in a year, that's how much service time you're going to want to write. So maybe for a student with like a lot of expressive language going on, you're going to say they need 60 minutes a week, or some districts write their service time monthly or annually. Doesn't really matter, but that's going to help you sort of develop your plan of care and write the IEP. And then for needs that can be supported in the classroom, or that don't require this specially designed instruction from a professional in that particular area, those are things that can be addressed through accommodations in the classroom, right? So that S sound that has an impact, but they just need reminders, that can be a classroom accommodation. Maybe students need help to organize their ideas when they're writing an essay, and you can have an accommodation for a graphic organizer or something like that. Anything else that needs support could end up becoming a suggested accommodation if it doesn't need specifically
I think Michelle is frozen again.
Yeah, I know. Bummer. Okay, I'm going to connect with her really quickly. Give me a second and we'll decide what we're going to do, okay?
speech All right.
I'm at.
So, sorry, this is like totally disruptive and I have like completely lost my train of thought. Okay,
Can I ask a quick question while you're trying to gain your train of thought back?
please do.
Awesome. So just out of curiosity, you mentioned the amount of service time or the amount of minutes based off of the goals. I'm in the process of writing my first IEP, my internship for SLP, and I'm sure my mentor will help me with this, but is there a formula to figure out how many minutes based off of goals or is
Yeah,
that
so thank you, because that's exactly what I was about to get to. So you helped me with my train of thought. So it is kind of abstract, right? Like, okay, like, so what? So I have these goals, and like, now how much time do I need to meet them? And so that's where this tool, the communication severity scales, can really come into play. So basically, you sort of go through and check off what are the areas that are really impacted in your particular student. And then based on how many areas and how impacted they are in their disability, it can help give you a range of time, at least, to say like this would be an appropriate amount of time to spend on these particular goals. Um, so yeah, I mean, they're also like some of that is a little bit policy driven, I think, even though it's meant to be, totally individualized and based on student need only. It's really common to see kids with like, standard amounts of time, right? So like a standard amount of time in my district would be a 30-minute session. So most kids on my caseload will get either like one 30-minute session or two 30-minute sessions if they're really have more extensive needs. So there are exceptions to that, but I think generally they're kind of like, yeah, and it just depends on like school bell schedules and like all kinds of stuff. So maybe your sessions are written as like 20-minute sessions instead of 30 minutes or whatever. Okay, so we're going to dive into literacy-based therapy finally. There are lots of reasons to use literacy as your context, and particularly if you're a speech language pathologist who works in schools, or I think some of you are special educators also. One of those reasons is that that's what the rest of educators are also doing, right? So literacy is the foundation of all of your academics. You spend the first couple years in school learning to read, and then the whole rest of your academic career reading to learn, right? And like your current academics are a testament to that, right? Like how much reading do you have to do in order to learn in your graduate program, right? Probably a lot. So by that logic, all school-based SLPs should have a significant focus on literacy. I used to use literacy-based therapy as the context for what I was doing like 95% of the time. And only in the past year or two, since we've come back from COVID, have I transitioned slightly more of that time to doing play-based therapy for, for students who I'm seeing a lot more students who like a population that I wasn't seeing before. But for the most part, I still use literacy-based therapy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean picture books in all of my sessions. Sometimes it's expository text and we're doing science and science experiments, but everything that I do for the most part is text-based in some way, shape, or form. Beyond that, though, there are lots of other benefits, obviously. Practicing skills in predictable contexts reduces the cognitive load of participation. And so if you have a real structured way that you're providing literacy-based therapy, or the real structured way that you're talking about books, it's going to help reduce the cognitive load in order for your students to actually gain the skills that you're trying to teach. Books obviously are also very language rich, and in AAC, this is particularly important because these are students who we know have fewer exposures to robust language. And so they get more opportunities to hear it, even if those words or those language structures aren't being like explicitly and directly targeted, right? There's lots of, sort of like implicit exposure to those things as well. And I do very strongly feel that it's possible to embed any goal into the context of literacy-based therapy, no matter what that goal is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So, of course, also there is a pretty large body of evidence supporting literacy-based or narrative-based interventions, including those that are specific to AAC. Some of these are getting a little bit older in age at this point, but I did also add a few additional points about research that's being done currently. So we know, obviously, that children who use AAC produce shorter narratives than their speaking peers. So for sure, that is an area of need. But there's also growing evidence to suggest that including aided input or modeling, whatever it's going by these days, improves not only expression, but also comprehension, which is relevant to the shared reading context as well. And then a variety of different literacy interventions have been used to improve word reading, vocabulary development, syntax and morphology, all kinds of things. So, if you're interested, definitely look up the work, not just these specific studies, but the ongoing work of these individuals and their teams. There's lots there. And then the last thing that I'll say before we talk more specifically about literacy-based therapy is that ASHA also really pushes for speech language pathologists, particularly in school-based settings, to have a really strong focus on literacy as well. And federal law mandates curriculum relevance too, and you can't really get more relevant than literacy and reading. So, okay. That all said, this is an important point that I want to make about what we are actually doing when we are doing literacy-based therapy, because we're not teaching students how to read per se. We're teaching them how to understand and manipulate the language that they encounter through reading. We're teaching them to connect ideas. We're teaching them to develop vocabulary, make inferences, which is also a social skill, draw conclusions, understand parts of the story so they can tell their own personal stories, their own personal narratives better. So all of that is sort of the underpinning of language that we are working on, not necessarily the letter sound correspondence or, or the phonics piece. Another way to think about that is that we're building schema. And I know you guys talk about building schema a lot in Michelle's classes. We're providing a framework within which to learn all the multitude of other skills that we're trying to teach. So again, this is another one. If you're interested in literacy, just generally, or literacy in AAC, definitely check out the work of these speech pathologists and educators. And check out the Common Core state standards. This is another really rich place to look for what is expected of students of a particular age. So it's not necessarily your like developmental trajectory like you learn about in grad school, but it's the trajectory that teachers are providing instruction, right? And there's lots here that relates to speech, language, executive function skills, that is sort of good grounds for providing services, right? So each of these, the like RL 2.6, would be reading and literacy, second grade, standard 6, right? So that's how you would look these up if you're not familiar with Common Core already. And again, these are just some of the things that, it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that you would find in the Common Core state standards that are expectations for students coming up through elementary school right now. Okay, so you hopefully saw the short video on the literacy-based therapy framework and what the steps are for that. There are lots of different frameworks for literacy-based therapy. I think Teresa Ukrainitz's is the most well supported, the most well researched, and also just kind of the easiest for me to wrap my head around. But there are other frameworks, some of which are linked here, that you may want to check out, which might resonate a little bit better with you. But generally, Teresa Ukrainitz's system is a 5-step framework. And so the way that this looks, at least in Michelle's class where we collaborate, is each of these steps gets its own day of the week. And so I come in there every day. On Mondays, we do the pre-reading knowledge activation. On Tuesdays, we do the dialogic reading so and so on. And that's just the easiest way for me to break it up. And then also helps to create the consistency and routine, and again, the sort of reducing the cognitive load. And I can come in and say like, okay, you guys, today is Monday. On Mondays, we always have a new book, and we are not reading the words, we're just looking at the pictures, right? If we're doing a book walk, or we do some other kind of like priming activity. So in terms of choosing a book, there are lots of books in the world, and many of them are excellent. There are just some like kind of basic guidelines that I use when I am thinking about choosing a book. I want it to be something, I said read in less than 10 minutes. The sort of impetus behind this is that I don't want to spend so much time focusing on reading the book that we're not actually able to target the goals, right? Rarely am I targeting the goals just through like reading the words. But there's some flexibility there, right? So in Michelle's class, I might do some like significant paraphrasing, right? I might basically just use the pictures of the book and not the words, and create kind of my own text to go with the pictures, right? If it's something that like really has a lot of text. You don't have to read all of the words. Another thing that I'll do with like gen ed kids, or particularly those in later elementary, like 4th and 5th grade, is if they're doing a read aloud in their classroom, their teacher is reading a chapter book, I might take a snapshot on my phone or on my iPad of one page. And we're going to take that one page and do a little analysis, right? We're going to search for vocabulary words. We're going to make inferences, whatever it is that my students are working on. We're just going to take that one page that they just read in class, or that they're going to read tomorrow, and do our analysis just on that. So, there's some flexibility there. It can also be split over multiple sessions, right? If you want to read half the book one day and then sort of do a recap and read the other half of the book the next time, that's also an option. I want to choose a book that has lots of demonstrations of the target that I want them to practice. Again, this is really flexible, and we'll talk about how when we go through the book, we'll talk about how the targets can be implied. They don't necessarily have to be explicit in the text, But articulation is always a really good example of this. If I have a student who's working on their L sound and I'm flipping through a book and I realize there are no demonstrations of the L sound in this story, then like maybe that's not a book that I want to choose to work, for that particular student. Um, so you have to be, or I try and be thoughtful about, the kinds of books that I'm choosing and for which groups of kids. Aligning with the curriculum is always great. And then scope and sequence is important in the sense that like it helps to have a real purposeful kind of arc to what you're doing. And so in Tackle, for example, we create monthly units, and each week will be a different book. So we'll have 4 books that relate to that monthly theme, but we have kind of like an overall, for this month, what are we hoping that students get out of the instruction that we're providing, right? Um, there was a period of time where I was doing, literacy-based therapy without really having a scope and sequence. I would show up with like whatever book I had or whatever I felt like reading that day. And, it works, but it works better now, the way that I do it now. Um, so, we may not have a curriculum per se to provide scope and sequence for us the way that educators have with, you know, um, Common Core or with whatever district curriculum is provided. Um, our scope and sequence as speech pathologists is just language development. What skills are required and in what order, and then how can you leverage the language that is available in a particular book to continue to advance those skills. Um, and you guys are familiar, obviously, with the zone of proximal development, which is fluid and changes as students learn and grow. But that's kind of where you want to be working, of course, always. There are lots of reasons why we read, and these ones were proposed by Patricia Carell and William Grabe. The first 6 of them are sort of a progression almost, right? So from scanning to skimming to reading for basic understanding, all the way up to reading to be able to critically evaluate. And this is true, whether you're a child or an adult. I'm sure that some of you have read research papers for your classes, which you were probably supposed to critically evaluate, but maybe you only read for basic understanding because that was what you had time for. That sort of thing. That sort of thing happens all the time. We, as typical, as adults, are able to set our purpose for reading for ourselves. We're able to understand why we are reading or how deeply we intend to read a piece of text. That's not necessarily true for kids, and particularly for kids with disabilities. The last one on there, read for pleasure. And I also just would personally add reading for social closeness as like as like an intimate act with someone that you care about or someone in your family, are sort of outside the rest of that progression. But um, point being, there are lots of different reasons why we might choose to read a book. And so that's something that you also want to consider when you're choosing texts for your students or your clients to read. They do this also in general education. A lot of times they'll do multiple reads of the same text, and each read gets a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper into understanding. So again, that's something that is reflected throughout the curriculum of general education. So, okay. Like I mentioned, we are able to set our own purpose for reading. We're able to understand why we're reading, how deeply we're reading. That is a learned skill. And it's something that we want to incorporate into our own reading in order to help facilitate students learning that skill. If there is no purpose set for the reading, it's really easy for that purpose to just become read this to remember everything. And that's really overwhelming and not super effective, right? Um, I remember taking tests or quizzes when I was in school also, and feeling like, okay, like I don't really know what I was looking for when I read this piece of text. So now I feel like I just have to like cram it all in my brain, which is not an effective way for me to learn the material. Alternatively, like read this to guess what I'm going to ask you. So the purpose for reading is something that I introduce at the beginning of my session, when I'm talking about here's the book that we have. Um, it is different from the IEP goal. It's related to the IEP goal, but it's different from the IEP goal. And it's aligned with sort of what the lesson objective is. So that's kind of another way that you can think about it, like just explaining what we are actually going to be doing through reading this book. Um, it should be sufficiently broad to encourage attention and participation to the entire book. If I say our purpose for reading is to find out who the main character is, and then the main character is introduced on the first page, well, what's the incentive to listen to the rest of the story, right? That my students already have the answer to the question. Maybe they can answer the question before I even open the book because the main character is right there on the cover. So thinking more along the lines of read to make up a new title for this story, right? In order to make up a new title, you really have to understand kind of everything that happens. Another one could be read to make a personal connection to the character. And in which case, like it's important to understand the entirety of their experience. So I start when I am planning a literacy-based session, I start with the IEP goal. I have to know what my student is working towards in order to know what I'm even doing. What targets am I going to pull out of this book? What questions am I going to ask? And then that IEP goal helps inform what my reading purpose is. I'll show you an example of this in just a second. Then that reading purpose, whatever they need to know in order to achieve that reading purpose, whatever advanced knowledge or whatever skills they need to practice in order to do that, that becomes my pre-reading knowledge activation. So whether that's specific vocabulary, whether they just need to build schema. If I'm reading a book about a beach, well, there are 6 students in wheelchairs in my class who, what are the chances they've been to a beach? What are the chances they know what that is like? So maybe the pre-reading knowledge activation, we're going to do like a virtual field trip, or maybe we'll actually, maybe I'll bring in some sand and we'll kind of talk about like, what are the parts of the beach? What can we expect there? So all of that information becomes the pre-reading knowledge activation. Otherwise, there's very little chance that my students are going to understand the content of the book that I'm about to present. And then the last part that kind of connects is the parallel story. And so sometimes I do a parallel story, sometimes I do a different kind of just like extension activity, but the point here is that all of the skills that we've practiced, it kind of like creates a nice little wrap it up with a bow at the end. We're going to practice these skills in a new context, or how can we take everything that we learned and now put it together and have this whole new skill, either to create a new story or to, again, somehow connect what we did with the rest of the outside world, right? So here's an example of a book that I often use at the beginning of the year, Chrysanthemum. is a story about a little mouse named Chrysanthemum who has a really tough time her first day of school. And so it's about like all of her anxieties, and some kids make fun of her because her name is too long and all of those kinds of things. So I had a student, I have many students, but I had one in particular whose goal was using the elements of a story, right? Character, setting, feelings, actions, to share personal news. We wanted him to be able to talk about what he did over the weekend, or things that were going on in his life. So knowing that his goal is to talk about things that are personal to him, my reading purpose then is going to be about personal connection, right? So we're going to read a story, but I want him to really focus on making a connection to something that he has experienced, because then later we're going to talk about his experience in the parallel story. The pre-reading knowledge activation then should probably address a discussion of feelings. What feelings do you know? Maybe if it were a very emergent communicator, we're just going to go through and navigate to the feelings on the devices and find out like what kinds of feelings there are. How do those things feel in your body? How do they look on your face? We're just going to have a big talk about feelings in order to understand then what happens in this book. For students with like a little bit more skill, we might look for clues about the feelings in the facial expressions of the characters. And Chrysanthemum is a really good book for that. Her facial expression and her nonverbal communication, her body language are all really rich in this book. And it's very, very apparent when she's feeling really happy versus when she's having a hard time and feeling sad. We might also talk about the cause and effect relationship. So this is something that I try to target really, really heavily for students who have some like basic story grammar skills, is connecting the character's feelings to the problem in the story or to the initiating event of the story. And then at the end, connecting the character's feelings to the resolution of the story in order to show that like, that there is a relationship between two things happening. So this might be 3 separate sessions with 3 different groups of kids, or if it's something, again, like Michelle's class, the tackle program, where we have a real range of skills and a real range of needs, this might all be kind of happening simultaneously for kind of different students at the same time within the same lesson. But then again, the sort of endpoint that we get to is the parallel story of that personal connection again. So if, we're working on this IEP goal about sharing personal news, here's an opportunity to do that. Tell us a story about how you felt on your first day of school, right? That's sharing a story about personal experience. The reason why these 3 steps of the literacy-based therapy framework are kind of outside the circle is that these are so flexible. The dialogic reading, the comprehension discussion, the focus skill activities, they sort of happen in my mind kind of like outside this cyclical process of the goals and the purpose, the knowledge activation, and the parallel story. So this is a very iterative process. Once we have done this parallel story and figured out like, what skills do they have? How are they using these skills in a new context? That then informs like, okay, like back to the IEP goal then. So how have they done, right? This is my progress monitoring. Do they need to continue working on this goal? Is it time to move on to a higher level, or maybe they need more support than I thought they would need? So this process kind of happens like in a cycle. but these three elements are, they sort of fit however you need them to fit. Okay, just a few things generally, and then we'll do a little walkthrough of one of my favorite books. Prepping your books in advance is so helpful, let me tell you. I will show you how I store all of my like pre-prepped materials. You also saw several slides back in the literacy-based therapy that I store all my books in hanging files, usually by like theme or kind of topic related. That way I kind of know where they are. And we often cycle through some of the same topics year after year, or maybe every other year. And that way, all of my books on that kind of theme are grouped together and easily findable. I love having reference sheets in the back of the book. So I'll show you how I keep those. That's where I draw out like all of the specific targets, not necessarily for specific students, but just kind of generally, like, what is this book good for? What can I do with it? How can I think about this book? Only spend time on materials that can be used or adapted to suit a variety of goals. This is a lesson that I learned the very long, very hard way. I used to make so many materials because I thought they were cool or they seemed, like they would be helpful or they look good on Instagram or whatever, right? I spent a lot of time doing that, and there are so many materials that I used once and never used again, or that I never even used the one time. I sort of like lost steam halfway through prepping it and was like, well, never mind. So I really like to create things that can be used sort of over and over again. I like to have frameworks and sort of like general supports that are flexible and adaptable. And then there are a couple links here for like a sample lesson plan for a literacy-based therapy lesson. And oh yeah, the last thing I'll say about materials is that one thing I've been trying to think about recently, specifically with respect to laminating, is do I need this thing to last forever on the earth? Because if it's encased in plastic, it is going to last forever on the earth, whether in my hands or somewhere else. So it's very, very rare that I laminate materials anymore. And also it's just easier. So, okay, I am going to share my doc cam. And we can look at a couple of books that I really like and how I prep them. Okay. So the first one I have here is Room on the Broom. Part of the reason why I usually choose this book is because I give this lecture around Halloween oftentimes, and it's just a fun thematic one. But I think this book is also really great for a lot of things. So like I said, I use it around Halloween. Oftentimes I will pull it out if we're doing a unit on like friendship or what it means to help other people. There's a lot of good stuff for that in this book as well. So, just because it's a witch and some monsters and her friends doesn't mean that we can't use it for something like friendship. So the way that I store my materials, I have these little like clear sticky back like library pockets, and I just smack them right in the back cover of the book. And then all of my little materials can go here and they can live in the book. And then everything is like already prepped and I never have to do it again. So this already is like more materials than I would prep for myself now. I just don't use this super a ton. These, however, are like the real game changer, I think. So I do have some kind of like field of choice, WH questions. I have some general just cards of characters or things that are important in the book. These are really nice. Like I said, I kind of don't use them anymore, but for a period of time, they were really nice because I can use these cards because they're so open-ended. I can use them to create sentences, right? If we're putting together sentences, I can use them as like sort of Arctic flashcards if I have the sounds that I need. I can use them in some kind of graphic organizer to help students retell the story, right? About like the witch encountering a dragon who wanted to eat her, you know, all kinds of stuff. So these cards are simple enough, they're open-ended enough that they can be used a lot of different ways. Which is, you know, which is good, which is my preference. These are really small, so it's going to be hard for you to see the text, but I have a big version. So this is basically like how I pull out all of the possible targets. If I'm thinking generally about a book and I want to prep it in advance, that way, like, you know, one day it'll just be ready to go. This is the reference sheet. This or something like it is what I want to create in order to be able to just have like a quick at a glance, like what all is in here, what can I do? So I'm going to start by talking about the themes, right? So we already kind of mentioned this. Either I can talk about, let's see, either I can talk about Halloween, I can use this in a Halloween unit, or I can use it in a unit about friendship. I might also put some reading purposes in here. Like, here are some things that we could set a reading purpose for depending on what the student's goals are. So reading to find out where the different animals live. They're all of these animals who, you know, request to be able to come on the broom with her, and they all live in a different habitat, and that's sprinkled throughout the book. So again, it requires my students to listen to the whole book if they're going to know where each of the animals live. We might read to find out how many animals can fit on one broom, which again requires us to listen all the way until the
Uh-oh. Let's give it a minute to see if she comes back.
And I'm going to reshare my screen. Okay, we're almost there, guys. Okay, so on to vocabulary. There's a lot of research around vocabulary development and what kind of vocabulary is important to teach. Core obviously is crucial for AAC users, and then tier 2 vocabulary is sort of the best practice for just like general vocabulary development. So tier 2 vocabulary is vocabulary that is academic in nature, but not context dependent. So things that can be used across lots and lots of different situations. Tier 3 vocabulary then would be things that are like really specific to one particular context, usually like science or math, right? So like mitochondria would be a tier 3 vocabulary word, something that you're really only going to use in that kind of specific situation. But tier 2 words are great because they can be used in so many different scenarios. Usually when I pull tier 2 words out, I try and also, for the purpose of my AAC users, define them using core words. That's the best way that I have found to be able to provide, really concise and understandable meanings for tier 2 words, is by defining them using core. Or providing a core word that's like a synonym, right? So most of these tier 1 or core words are things that that come up in this text a lot. And the reason why I chose words that come up in the text a lot is just because, again, they're going to have repeated exposures to it. So part of Room on the Broom is it has a few different kind of like repeated lines in the text. So, every couple of pages, she loses an article of clothing. And then it always says, "Down," cried the witch, and they flew to the ground. So down was one of my tier 1 core words because it's repeated over and over and over throughout the book. I don't have it in here, but like find or found is another one that is repeated through this same line of text several times. And I could have put in my tier 1. Oh, I did put it. Just kidding. So, most of the tier 1 or core words that I am using are things that come up throughout the book many, many times. I do have a better example of choosing words that are implied rather than explicitly stated, but I'm actually going to show you a different book for that. So same thing with a lot of these others. Gone is another repeated line of the text. The witch tapped the broomstick and whoosh, they were gone. That's another thing that comes up over and over. The last vocabulary kind of thing is multiple meaning words. These can be really fun if they are at like an appropriate developmental level for your clients. Multiple meaning words can be very silly to target. I'm thinking about like bat and bat. Or, spell is one that they may be academically familiar with, right? Saying the letters of a word, but maybe they're less familiar with the meaning of spell that is like a magic thing that a witch does. So I think multiple meaning words can be really cool. So I usually pull out any multiple meaning words that there are in the story that I'm reading. And to some extent, like most things, right? Like this kind of framework can be adapted for what kind of information you're looking for. I haven't used the multiple meaning words section in a while because not a lot of my students are working on that. I have a lot of emergent communicators the past couple of years. And so we're not necessarily doing those kinds of things. Categories and concepts that can be targeted through this book. One that pops out straight away are the different animals. Each of the animals, the cat, the dog, here's an owl. There's a bird and a frog and a dragon, if you count a dragon as an animal later on. Those are all things that we can talk about through this book. The category or concept of Halloween, we can work to build schema. We can work to, again, talk about some of that like fringe vocabulary. I started to say there is some research around having a good balance of core and fringe vocabulary when you're doing shared readings like these, based on story retells of typical 5-year-olds. The core words are used a lot, but oftentimes the tier 2 or the fringe words are used, really, really carry a lot of meaning. And so I think several years ago, Gail Van Tatenhove proposed like a 4-to-1 ratio of core versus fringe when doing shared reading. And I'm pretty sure that research is linked at the end as well. Basic and inferential questions, I will generally pull out. A lot of times what I'll do for these, either in addition to or instead of putting them on kind of my like quick sheet, I'll put them on sticky notes on the page that I want to ask about them. And then they can just live in the book on the page. And so when I go to do a book read and I'm reading it with my students, I get to this page and I'm like, oh yeah, this is a question that I wanted to ask exactly right now at this time. And it can give me, sort of a reminder, particularly if I'm in a hurry and maybe I haven't done my due diligence of looking at a book before I'm about to use it. It can be really helpful. There are lots of things to remember, and it can be hard to hold them all in my own brain. So having things to cue myself, are also really helpful. And then the last bit is story grammar. I always pull out story grammar, and I'll show you the story grammar framework that I use, but almost 100% of the time we are talking about, if we're using a fiction text, we're basically always talking about the story grammar. Who are the characters? What's the setting? The initiating event or the problem, and on and on. So that's kind of how I go through and just create like a cheat sheet essentially for myself for a particular book. And then, these same categories or these same, kind of like characteristics of the book can be used for lots of different sessions over the course of many years, regardless of who my students are or what their specific goals are. There's always something here that I can kind of pull out and say like, oh yeah, this would be good for so-and-so. And again, like there are other sort of dimensions that you could analyze too, depending on how you want to do literacy-based therapy or what the needs of your students are. You could pull out different like categories of words or stuff like that. One of the ones that I didn't do on this particular page, but I have on here are
Sorry, team.
Hey, Michelle, while we wait for Melissa to rejoin us, I have a quick question.
Of course.
So, I've used the sticky note thing on books as well for like questions I want to ask students. But somehow I have some students who have very quick fingers, and the sticky notes get removed before I even get a chance to ask the questions. Am I the only one who's had this issue with sticky notes? I mean, I've started to kind of do what she did with the cheat sheet and just put down page numbers and stuff, but it's
Yeah, I know. I think that's not an uncommon experience.
okay.
Anyone
Cool.
have a solution that they've come up with?
I thought about taping them.
Good. Welcome back, Melissa.
I feel like it's just happening more the longer we go.
Andrea has a question about kids taking off the sticky notes. Do you have any suggestions for the sticky fingers with the sticky notes?
Well, I will say that I don't often experience that problem given the motor control of the students who I'm primarily using this framework with. I do my best to set the expectation that I am in control of the materials in a session, and which is also part of the reason why I try and be very minimal about the materials that I'm using. Yeah, I haven't had that problem. So, I mean, I think other ways to cue yourself would be also equally as effective if you're finding that students taking the sticky notes off is a problem for you. Um, you know, I have my interns often like write themselves a script of what they're going to say and what questions they're going to ask. So they don't necessarily have to put them in the book, but they know in advance what questions they're going to be asking on what page. So sometimes I think even having that, thinking about that in advance can be just as helpful.
Yeah, I was telling Michelle, it's mainly my TKers who grab my sticky notes, especially since this is the first experience being in a school setting, and it's only been a month or so, or 2 months technically, maybe 2 months now. But yeah, I create a cheat sheet that has page numbers with L words or K words or whatever we're working on for the day, but I just thought it was a funny little anecdote. I was wondering if anyone else has sticky fingers and sticky notes.
Definitely happened to me.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I don't use the sticky notes with my preschool groups, so I'm sure that if I did, that would be an issue. Okay, I'm like concerned that I'm gonna get kicked off again, so I'm gonna do like one more thing and then we're calling it. I'm taking questions. I just wanted to show you so I mentioned that that the targets don't have to be directly in the text of the story. You make up the text ultimately. Unless you're having your students participate in reading the text, there's really no reason why you need to read all of the words if you don't want to. So the core vocabulary, the tier 1 and the tier 2 words from the last example were pulled directly from the text. But this is another book that I really like, called Do As Talk. And it's just a really good example of how words can be implicit, how your targets can be implicit. And the reason why it's a good example is because this book is written in not a language. It's gibberish. So there are also plenty of like wordless picture books and stuff out there that I'm sure you guys are really familiar with. This one I think is really beautiful. The illustrations and also just the story is like really simple and cool. But all of the words are not in a language that any of my students understand. So we might target this Do As Talk is repeated throughout the text. I interpret that to mean, what is that? They're asking a question. What is that? And so that might be one of our targets throughout the book, either what or that or asking a question. One of the things that we often talk about with this text is the different types of punctuation, right? So there's questions, there are statements, and then there are exclamations. And so we might talk about how your voice changes when you see each of those types of punctuation, right? If you're asking a question, if you see a question mark, your intonation is going to go up at the end of your sentence. If you see an exclamation, you're going to say it with emphasis or really loud. Those are the kinds of things that we might talk about. This book I also really like for talking about strategic competence, because it's in a gibberish language. We can talk about like, what do we do when we don't understand the words that somebody is saying? Can we use their gestures or their their body language to interpret it? Can we find words that sound like a word that we might recognize? Ma ebedau unk plank, I think it's a plant. Plonk and plant sound kind of the same, right? So that's how I'm going to interpret that word. So just all of that to say that, like, if there are no words or gibberish words or whatever in your book, the same strategies that you would use to teach that text can also apply to a text that does have words, and that to like Room on the Broom. So anyway, so that is pretty much that. I have like one more thing that I said I would show you. So this is the story grammar framework that I use. It's called Story Grammar Marker. And what I like about it is that all of the story grammar parts are really concrete. So in the past, I have used, first, next, then, last, with like really varied success. I know a lot of gen ed teachers use beginning, middle, and end. The problem that I often have with beginning, middle, and end is that, like, I say, okay, what happened in the beginning of the story? And then a student just tells me the whole story, right? Like, what are the boundaries between the beginning and the middle, or the middle and the end? So I like Story Grammar Marker because the parts are very concrete, so we talk about the character, the setting, the initiating event or the problem, the internal response, the plan. It could be a sequence of events, maybe, depending on the story that you're reading, and then the consequence and resolution. So this is the one that I like the best. The pieces also relate really nicely to informational texts. So I have found a lot of success with students learning narrative first, and then if we're transitioning to informational texts as they're getting older and need more academic skills, the story grammar pieces can map really nicely onto different types of expository text as well. And then the last thing, one question that I often get is, where do I get all my books? How do I find books? And I have been practicing for many, many years now, and have sort of built my repertoire of books, lots of which I have purchased myself or through Donors Choose. The library I really like, my school library or the public library, for getting books. But this app, Little Stories, is what I used to use when I was still really in the process of building my own library of books, of building my own repertoire. And Little Stories it has, like 100 stories or whatever. They're all very short, and they all contain different articulation sounds. So they're like heavily loaded with artic sounds. But then for each story, there are also all of these other sections that you can kind of do, you can complete like through the app, and then they have guidance on how to score them. So like story retell, sequencing, WH questions. The story talk is just sort of like, it's like topic generating, basically. So like, okay, we read this story, like, let's talk about a time when you were, when you helped someone else. So they also have, in addition to the phonemic targets here, they have themes, and the books are kind of grouped into categories around like helping others or doing hard things or whatever, kind of like SEL, social emotional learning kind of topics.
What's this called again?
It's called Little Stories.
Okay.
It's by Little Bee Speech, the same people who make Articulation Station, and they have a couple other apps. So their little like logo is this little bee kind of guy. And ASHA convention is coming up. They usually have some kind of discount during ASHA convention as well. And that is it. So I know that it was a very quick and sort of stop and go lecture today. And there is a lot to unpack about literacy-based therapy that we can't necessarily get to through, one online lecture. So if you guys have questions or you're interested or are looking for resources or like further reading, whatever, I really, really would encourage you to reach out to me. And my contact information is in the slides and probably on iLearn. I'm happy to talk about any of it. This is what I do, as I said, like 95% of the time. So yeah, Elizabeth.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for tonight. I just had a question. If my linguistic goal for my student is to combine 2 to 3 word constructions, would I be looking at that tier 1, tier 2 vocabulary to try to elicit those words that are kind of repeated through the book, or how would you recommend that?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could also take a look at what kind of like sentence structures are occurring in the text of the book, and maybe that's how you want to pull out those targets. So like for do as talk, right? Like what is that? That would be a 2 to 3 word construction. And maybe you could focus on like 2 to 3 word constructions that like serve a variety of communicative functions. I don't know what their linguistic goal is, but yeah, I mean, I think like some books, particularly with repeated lines of text, will have like a particular sentence structure that they kind of reuse over and over. And that's a good way to kind of pull those targets out. But otherwise, that could also be part of like a story retell, right? 2 to 3 word constructions to talk about like each step of the story, like what happened. There are lots of ways that I think goals like that can be targeted, and that's what I love about literacy-based therapy, is that it's just super flexible.
Thank you.
Somebody had a question about using literacy-based therapy with older populations. I feel like now would be a really great time to ask that question.
Oh, hello. Hi, Melissa. It's Anita. I actually did have that question. I'm observing a 17-year-old, and I have not worked with a student in that age group. So do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, do you know anything about like what they like to read?
Well, from my observations, he really likes books like Brown Bear, those kind of stories that are more like toddler type age group books. But I don't know, I'm just having trouble. Like I want to choose something that's like meaningful for him, that's like more age appropriate, but then I know that, I don't know. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm like going in circles trying to figure out like what to choose for him.
Yeah, I think that can be kind of like the hardest, I don't know, group of books, I guess, is books that are age appropriate for people with really emergent literacy skills.
Mhm.
One resource that I really like is Newsela or Newsela. They basically have, they have lots of different resources, but a lot of them are, sort of like news oriented, excuse me, or like, they have like a bunch of articles that sort of like center around a particular topic, but you can change the reading level. So you can print the same article at like a Lexile of 1,000 or a Lexile of like 500, and it'll adjust the sentence structure and the vocabulary and the complexity of the text in order to meet a variety of different reading levels, which, may or may not be sort of like where your student is at, but that's one way to sort of get at more kind of age appropriate topics, if those literacy skills are still needing a lot of development.
News ELA or Newsella?
Yeah, some people say it different ways. It's news and then ELA, like English language arts.
Thank you.
Anita, another idea would be to use wordless books.
I was thinking that when she was talking. Yeah, I was actually thinking that.
Or graphic novels, or like, there are lots of different directions that you can go. Also, I think when I was in grad school, they really pushed like it has to be age appropriate, even if a student's interests or skill levels were developmentally a lot younger. My personal opinion is that I think it's okay if that's what a student's interests are. I think it's really okay to use things that they're interested in, even if I don't want to like pass judgment on somebody just because like they're really interested in children's books. Like, I'm an adult and I'm really interested in children's books, so like and also like I have taken a lot of foreign language classes where they use like fairy tales, for example, in order to teach the vocabulary and the language skills, because they're familiar, right? And so again, if we're talking about like reducing the like cognitive complexity or the cognitive load, like everybody knows these fairy tales. It's easier to learn the vocabulary when you're familiar with the story already, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Another good resource for older kids for their books is getepic.com. They have a lot of really good like graphics. I had a kiddo.
I've used epic.com before. I used it with my kiddos for audiobooks.
Yeah, Epic is cool. You can also like assign books to like your class. You can create a class and like send books to parents and stuff. I also got a question about incorporating Gestalt language with books that don't have repeated phrases. I like to make up repeated lines of text for books that don't have repeated lines of text. There are lots of ways that that you can incorporate like, some like repetition, even if it's not inherent in the book itself. And like, one thing that I like to say is that like the book is not a script for you to follow. It's a tool for you to use. And whatever way you need to change or adapt the language or the text or even the pictures. I mean, sometimes like if I just want to focus on a couple of pages, or I want to like take out this like whole middle part of a story that I don't think is relevant, I might just scan the pages that I want and make a new book in a Google slide with the pictures that I do want to use. And so I think, some of that is just thinking really flexibly about the books that you have and about the tools that you have and using them in whatever way you want, right? Like nobody's going to come, like the copyright police aren't going to show up and bang down your door for not reading every single word of a text or for making up new words.
You have Melissa. Any questions about more planning for literacy-based therapies related to your upcoming assignment? All right.
All right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Kian, under the wire.
Yeah, so the student that I'm looking at is a very emergent communicator, like a very beginning emergent communicator. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to, and maybe this isn't correct, but to help her nod for yes and shake her head for no. And so I was looking at a book that had a lot of yes and no language in it. And is that an appropriate goal for her, or do I need to add more? I just want to have your feedback because she's very new to everything. She's 3 years old and she's nonverbal, and it's difficult for her to even make utterances. And so I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly can be appropriate to use like a nod and a head shake for yes and no. I have certainly had that goal with some of my own students in the past. And definitely have used books with like heavy repetition of yes and no in order to help target that. In order to help target at least like the motor movement and get a lot of practice with the motor movement, not necessarily with like accurately answering yes and no. You know, I think that for a lot of our kids who are particularly complex, who have like particularly complex bodies, it's really important to try and shape like whatever conventional communication you can. You know, like, and some kids may not get there, right? But like if a conventional gesture or some type of conventional communication is within their means, I think it's important to have that, because that is going to open up their world a little bit and like who they're able to communicate with. So you know, if you think that's within reach for that student, I would say for sure go for it.
I guess I have a quick question. One of my, the kiddo for this assignment, is working on prepositions. So, I broke down my long-term goal into smaller objectives by saying, okay, we're gonna do today we're gonna do above. Next session we'll do below. We'll do in and out. We separated above and below just because in previous sessions before doing literacy-based therapy, she was having difficulty discriminating between the two, so we didn't want to implement them both at the same time. We wanted to strictly focus on one. But I'm assuming that would be an appropriate goal for how we broke that up, by just each session we would be doing different prepositions, and we're also implementing her AAC device. So we'll be introducing the I'm sorry, it's late and my brain just had forgot the term icon. Introducing the icons to her as well, because in the past we weren't using her AAC device. We've been only using verbal speech, but we're now addressing her AAC goal. I think there was a question in there. My brain's very tired at the moment, and I do apologize.
Yeah, I think, you know, I would look into like there's a developmental trajectory for prepositions also. You know, it's not, again, like you don't necessarily have to follow the developmental trajectory if there's something that is going to be really like personally relevant for a client, then maybe you want to target those things first. You know, but I would consider making sure that like earlier developing prepositions have been mastered, and then you know, sort of moving from there. And I think as a first pass, separating out the opposites, I think that's fine. If it doesn't work to target opposites at the same time because it's too, it's too confusing to have above and below. Because if you're doing like two objects, right, one is always above and one is always below. So like maybe it is really confusing to say which one is above and which one is below, or to answer those kinds of questions. But yeah, sorry. Hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
I think it did. I'm not quite sure what the question was anymore, but yes, it definitely did. She has mastered in, out, off, on, and a few other prepositions as well. So we've been moving up. So we are somewhat following the hierarchy when it comes to prepositions. We've just been struggling with above and below. So and I completely get it because we made a bridge and she had to put Anna underneath the bridge and she put it on the bridge. So then I told her that the bridge was under Elsa, or Anna. So we're moving on to based therapy, literacy based therapy. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Melissa, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to have you here.
Thank you. I'm wondering, is this book a good book for the literacy-based therapy?
It's a
I
great
love that
book.
book.
Yeah,
I use
it's a
it all the
great
time.
book.
I'm going to use it with, so I transferred centers, but I'm going back to my old center to do it with the kiddos.
That'll be great.
But I'm wondering, Michelle, what other day can I do my appointment?
Yeah, let's let Melissa go, and then those of you who have meetings with me, you can stay on, or if you would like to have a meeting with me, we can schedule it. So thank you so much, Melissa. I'm gonna stop the recording.